Have you ever imagined the quietest moment of a day suddenly breaking apart when a shadowed figure staggers out of nowhere, looking more like it's risen from the grave than from the earth? A trembling body, half collapsed, dropping lifeless at the doorstep of a man who hadn't let another soul cross his threshold in years. Out here on the frontier, where every life hangs as fragile as a flame in the wind, such a thing truly happened, and it changed one man's life forever. Before we dive into this strange and haunting turn of fate, don't forget to hit the like button and leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support keeps these frontier stories alive, and I promise you what follows will hold your attention until the very last word. Arizona Territory, late autumn, 1882. A day's ride from the nearest town, in a stretch of country where the earth cracked from drought and wind rolled dust across the valley like it wanted to swallow the world whole, stood a lone cabin pressed against a ridge of stone. It was the refuge of Caleb Mercer, a widowed cowboy who had withdrawn from mankind after losing his wife and unborn child to sickness 5 years earlier. Caleb was 36, shoulders as broad as a hewn beam, hands scarred and hardened by axework and the daily grind of tending stock. But his face bore years far beyond his age. Grief had cut permanent lines across his brow and mouth. He spoke little, smiled even less, and moved about his chores in silence. For Caleb, silence had become his only companion. That morning, as the sun slid over the ridge, Caleb noticed a circle of buzzards drifting far out toward the brush. He thought nothing of it. Likely a coyote carcass, maybe a steer gone astray. But toward dusk, with an armload of firewood pressing into his chest, his eyes caught something at the edge of the scrub. Not an animal, not a hunter, a person. The figure staggered barefoot, leaning hard on one side, then pitched forward into the dirt and did not rise again. Caleb froze. The wood spilled from his arms. His hand went for the Winchester propped by the door. Instinct as old as his scars. This land was never free of danger, debt dodgers, drifters, or worse. But as he stepped closer, he saw the truth. The fallen figure was a woman. Her skin was bronze from the sun, her hair long, dark, tangled into knots. Her buckskin dress was torn, dust-choked and stained. One shoulder lay bare, her chest heaving shallow, her legs bruised and raw. The blisters on her feet spoke of miles traveled, each one harder than the last. She wasn't just hurt. She was dying slowly, cruelly from thirst and hunger. For a heartbeat, Caleb's chest tightened, the old wall of caution rising inside him. His mind whispered warnings, Apache. Who is she? Why is she here? A lure, a trap. He had seen too many bloody misunderstandings in these hills. He had no interest in stepping into another. Yet when he knelt beside her, the sound of her breath told him all he needed to know. It rasped and caught like a rope fraying at its last strand. One hand clutched at the ragged front of her dress, a small, desperate act of dignity. Caleb spoke low, his voice rough with disuse. Can you hear me? Easy now. I won't hurt you. Her eyelids fluttered, fear flickering through them like a cornered animal, and then she went still, unconscious. There was no time left for debate. Caleb dropped the rifle, slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees, and lifted. The weight surprised him. Not heavy, but frighteningly light, the kind of light that comes from weeks of starvation. Her head sagged against his chest, fever heat burning through his sweat-damp shirt. He gritted his teeth. Every instinct told him to guard his cabin, to keep the world out. But another instinct, older and stronger, told him this if he left her. She wouldn't see morning. His boots struck the hard ground in heavy rhythm as he carried her toward the cabin door. Each step sounded like a drumbeat in his chest. A question pounding louder, was he carrying danger into his home? Or was he carrying salvation for someone the world had already abandoned inside? He laid her gently upon the narrow bed, his eyes sharp, his guard unbroken. And yet, somewhere beneath that caution, he felt something stir a faint tremor against the silence he had worn like armor all these years. His cabin, once still as a grave, now held another breath within its walls, weak and fragile as it was. That breath carried enough weight to shake the lonely fortress Caleb Mercer had built around his own heart. Inside the small cabin, the fire in the hearth cracked and breathed against the desert night, trying to push back the chill that crept in through the chinks of the walls. Caleb sat in his chair, broad frame bent forward, eyes fixed on the woman lying on his bed. She burned with fever, breath ragged, chest rising too fast beneath a blanket. Her dark hair clung to one cheek, tangled with road dust and sweat. He'd covered her with the heaviest wool he owned, but he couldn't be sure it was enough to hold her in this world. Sometime past midnight, she stirred, jolting awake. Her eyes black and wide flashed with the wild fear of a trapped animal. Seeing Caleb seated nearby, one hand resting on his knee, the other close enough to reach for the rifle leaning against the wall, she pulled the blanket high across her chest, trembling. "Don't!" Her voice rasped, thin and broken. "Don't touch me." Caleb didn't move. He knew that look, knew that sound. He'd seen people cornered by worse than sickness. His voice came low, even. "Steady, I won't. You're safe here." She scanned the room, eyes darting from door to shutter to him again, like she was measuring escape. Then, barely above a whisper, "My people. They said I brought shame. They said my body made men look, that I caused the wrong to come." Caleb's jaw tightened. The words cut sharp, though not meant for him. He saw the shame in the way her shoulders curled, the way her hand gripped the blanket like a shield. "They cast you out?" he asked. She gave the smallest nod, biting her lip until a bead of blood showed. "I fought. I refused. But they said I was too much, that I didn't belong, that I was unworthy." Caleb looked at her, not at the torn dress clinging to her, not at the curves hidden beneath the wool. He fixed on her eyes, the eyes heavy with doubt, not only in him, but in herself. His reply came slow, deep. "It wasn't your fault. Hear me, you didn't do anything wrong." She turned her face away, breath hitching. She wanted to believe. He could see that. But belief was a long road. The night dragged on. Caleb spread a hide on the floor and lay down far from the bed. He didn't sleep hard, every creak of the cabin boards pulling his eyes open. Part of him was wary he had a stranger under his roof, and the world had taught him too well. But another part of him, older, restless, wouldn't let him look away from the fragile rhythm of her breathing. It had been years since he felt a pulse inside his cabin that wasn't his own. At first light, when the fire sank to coals and pale dawn slipped through the shutters, Caleb rose to stoke the flames and set coffee to boil. He turned and found her awake already, lying on her side, watching him. Her eyes weren't frantic now, but suspicion still lived in them. "Where am I?" she asked. "My land," he said quietly, "south of Dry Fork." She clutched the blanket tighter, voice still wary. "You live alone, I do. 5 years now." She said nothing for a while. Her gaze drifted toward the tin cup he held out. Steam curled above it. The smell of coffee filled the cabin. She studied his face for a long second, searching for a trap, before reaching out with trembling fingers. The first sip made her flinch, then soften. Warmth spread across her lips, down her throat. For a moment, her suspicion eased, though it lingered just behind her eyes. Caleb took his own seat across from her, hands wrapped around his mug. He didn't ask questions, didn't press. He knew the weight of questions when a person wasn't ready to carry them. Later, when he set a bowl of corn mush before her, she ate cautiously, slow, every motion balanced between hunger and distrust. She never stopped watching him, like a deer in tall grass, ready to bolt. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "Why? Why did you help me?" Caleb's hand rested on the table, scarred knuckles standing out pale against the wood. He met her eyes, his answer plain and unpolished. "Because you needed help. That's all." The words settled heavy in the room. Doubt didn't vanish, but something shifted. She didn't argue, didn't try to leave. Caleb knew it wouldn't come easy. Her trust had been beaten down by those closest to her. And his own heart, hardened to stone, had been locked behind silence for half a decade. Now here they both were, two souls standing on opposite banks of a river of suspicion, staring across the fog. But at least, for the first time, they had begun to look. Morning sunlight slipped through the cracks in the shutters, catching the drift of dust in the air. The cabin was quiet as always, yet something in it had shifted. The woman no longer lay curled in bed like someone waiting for death. Wrapped in a blanket around her shoulders, she had managed to rise, moving carefully, following Caleb out to the porch. He swung his axe in steady strokes, each blow splitting logs with the same hard rhythm he had lived by for years. Sweat ran in lines across his brow, yet his eyes stayed guarded, watchful. From near the fence, Nayeli stood still, hands folded at her chest, watching in silence. Something in her gaze made him stop. He set the log aside and looked her way. "You can sit," he said. His tone was neither command nor request, just an acknowledgement. She gave a slight nod, eyes blinking softly. For the first time, there was not only suspicion in her face, but a trace of something else, hesitation, edged with the beginning of trust. The days that followed no longer held only the sound of wind pushing through the cracks of the walls. Nayeli began to move about the cabin, still weak, but determined. She swept the floor, folded the bedding, washed the dishes after they ate. Caleb didn't stop her, didn't give orders. He had grown used to solitude, but her presence didn't weigh as heavy as he expected. In fact, it stirred something he had thought buried long ago, the rhythm of sharing a life under the same roof. One evening, when the sun dipped red behind the hills, Caleb sat on the porch sharpening a knife, the grind of stone against steel steady in the dusk. Nayeli sat nearby, patching the frayed shoulder of his shirt. Her hands trembled slightly, but her focus didn't waver. "Why?" she began, voice tight. "Why do you live alone?" For so long Caleb paused, the knife gleaming in the light. Silence hung between them, heavy as stone. At last, his voice came slow, rough as gravel. "My wife and the child she carried. They both died in the sickness back in '77. I dug the graves myself, buried them on the rise behind the barn. After that, there wasn't anything left worth saying to anyone." The words dropped heavy, final. Caleb bent his head again, drawing the blade along the stone, though his hand had gone stiff, knuckles pale with strain. Nayeli set down her needle. Her dark eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She knew what it was to carry loss, to be cast out, to have the world turn its back. For the first time, she looked at him and did not see a threat, but a man marked by pain not unlike her own. Slowly, she spoke. "I was accused, one of the elders. He wanted me silent when he sought to use me. I refused. They said it was my body that caused men to sin. They said I was a shame. They tied me outside the council tent, left me for judgment." Her voice was flat, the edges dulled by endurance, but her hand clenched until her nails pressed into her palm. Caleb's eyes lifted, sharp, then softened. "They were wrong. None of that was your fault." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "I want to believe, but when even your own blood turns away, it hollows you. Caleb laid the knife aside and looked straight at her. His gaze didn't flinch. I know. When my wife passed, neighbors brought food for a time, but after a while, they stopped. I stopped answering the door. One day I realized I'd buried myself right alongside her, still breathing, but already gone. Nayeli's breath caught. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a silence that held recognition. Two wounds speaking to each other without need of more words. The next day, they worked side by side, mending the corral fence. Caleb drove nails into the posts, hammer ringing against wood. Nayeli held the rails steady, small hands firm, jaw set with effort. Sweat darkened Caleb's shirt, and she matched his rhythm without complaint. They spoke little, but each glance, each shared task, built a quiet thread between them. When the hammer slipped and smashed Caleb's thumb, he cursed low under his breath. Nayeli startled, rushing to him, catching his hand. "Are you hurt?" she asked quickly, concern sharp in her voice. He meant to pull away, but her eyes were too near, too earnest. He nodded once, just foolish. She didn't let go at once. Her fingers lingered around his rough, scarred hand longer than needed. When she did release him, her eyes held something new, not fear, not doubt, but compassion. That evening, the fire glowed low in the hearth. Caleb sat binding the bruised nail, while Nayeli stirred a pot of soup. They didn't fill the air with talk. Yet the silence was no longer defensive. It had become something shared. At last, she spoke, her voice quiet for the first time. "I don't feel so alone." Caleb looked at her, his gray eyes steady. He didn't answer. He lifted his bowl, drank, and set it back down. But in the unspoken space between them, something had taken root, a seed of trust, a sliver of empathy, and perhaps the first trace of a bond neither of them had dared imagine. That morning, Caleb rose early as always. He stepped outside to tend the fire pit and check on the horses. When he came back, he stopped short in the doorway. Something in the cabin felt different, instead of the usual stillness. There was the soft clatter of wood on iron, the smell of warm cornmeal, and the sight of a woman bent over the hearth. Nayeli had risen before him. Her long black hair was tied up, her shoulders wrapped in one of his old shirts that hung loose against her frame. She stirred a pot with quiet focus, the firelight softening her features. She wasn't sitting silent in the corner anymore. She was stepping into the rhythm of the cabin itself. Caleb hung his coat on the peg, leaning against the wall, watching. Every movement she made, setting the table, washing a dish. Stacking wood by the door was careful, deliberate, as if she was stitching herself back together one small task at a time. "You don't have to do all that," he said, voice low. She turned her head, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "I don't want to sit idle. I can work." It wasn't a request. It was a statement. In the days that followed, her presence grew steady, natural. She mended the torn shoulder of his shirt, stitches neat and even. She swept the floor, cleared cobwebs from the rafters. When Caleb climbed onto the roof to replace rotten shingles, Nayeli braced the ladder, passing him nails and tools, her eyes never leaving his figure. Other times, Caleb sat by the porch working leather straps while she scattered grain for the chickens. The clucking filled the yard with a liveliness he hadn't heard in years. More than once, he found himself pausing just to watch. The cabin, once cold and lifeless, now carried the pulse of two people moving together. One afternoon, as they hauled cut wood behind the barn, Caleb heard her laugh. Not loud, not long, but honest. He turned. She was looking down at her hands, streaked with dirt, yet her eyes shone with something brighter. Pride, maybe. It struck him how far she had come from the broken figure he had carried inside. One evening, after supper, Caleb reached for a guitar that had gathered dust in the corner. He rarely played anymore. The sound carried too many memories of his wife. But that night, he tried a few chords. The notes came rough, a little out of tune, but warm. Nayeli sat close to the fire, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on him. She said nothing, but the tilt of her head and the quiet attention in her face gave him more than words. When he let the last chord fade, she nodded once. "Beautiful," she whispered. "It's the first time in a long while my heart feels at rest." Caleb gave her a small smile, a rare one, but real. Intimacy did not arrive in sudden touches or heated words. It came in small things, fixing a roof together, sharing a meal in silence, sitting by the fire without needing to fill the air. Slowly. The guarded distance between them eased. When their eyes met, neither looked away so quickly anymore. A faint smile here, a softer tone there, built a bridge stronger than questions could. Once, when Caleb tried hauling a water bucket too heavy. The handle slipped, jerking his wrist. Nayeli stepped in at once, steadying the weight, her hand gripping his. He meant to pull away, but she held firm. "Let me," she said calmly. He let her. For a heartbeat, their eyes met close, steady. No words were needed. That night, as Caleb laid out his blanket on the floor, Nayeli's voice stopped him. "You don't have to keep doing that. There's room here. You on one side, me on the other." He studied her a moment, then gave a short nod. He lay down on the far edge of the bed, their backs turned, no touch between them. Yet the sound of her breathing near his shoulder, the sense of another heartbeat in the same space, it was more closeness than he had allowed himself in years. From a woman who once trembled and doubted every step, Nayeli had begun to walk with steadiness again. She moved with quiet confidence through the cabin, shaping it with her hands, her care. And Caleb, who had lived only with silence and grief, began to see the place not as a shelter against the world, but as the beginning of a home. Confidence, trust, and intimacy grew not in leaps but in measured steps, stitched into the fabric of each day. And for Caleb Mercer, that was enough to know he was no longer alone. Winter wind cut across the Arizona valley, sharp and dry, carrying a chill that stung the skin. Gray clouds dragged low over the ridges, muting what little light the sun offered. Caleb's cabin stood as it always had, weathered against the elements. But inside, it no longer held only silence. The click of a needle in Nayeli's hands, the steady thud of Caleb's hammer, the restless cluck of hens in the yard, these sounds had become part of the rhythm of life. Then one afternoon, the sound of hooves shattered that fragile peace. Caleb was fastening the barn door when he heard it, hoofbeats rolling across the dirt, heavy and sure. He turned, eyes narrowing, his hand drifting to the revolver at his side. On the dusty track north of the cabin, 2 riders appeared. Their horses were well fed, their posture steady, not the gait of drifters. One was young, with a half-smile curling his mouth. The other was older, his eyes sharp, scanning every angle of the land. Nayeli had been scattering feed for the chickens. At the sound, her hand froze, fear flickering in her face. "Not my people," she whispered, "but not friends either." Caleb stepped to the porch, broad shoulders squared, his stance unyielding. The riders pulled up in a spray of dust, reins creaking. "Good afternoon," the younger one called lightly. "We're looking for the trail to the trading post. Heard it cut somewhere near here." Caleb answered flat, his voice carrying no warmth but no threat. "Keep west till you hit the fork. Take the left." The older man studied him a long moment, eyes narrowing, then shifted his gaze toward the porch as though searching for something hidden inside. Caleb moved forward, blocking the view, hand resting easy but firm on the grip of his gun. "I live alone," he said evenly, steel beneath the words. For several tense breaths, nothing stirred but the horse's snorts in the cold air. At last, the older rider gave a curt nod. "Appreciate it." They turned their mounts and rode off, leaving a trail of dust fading into the horizon. Caleb stood rooted until they disappeared from sight. Only then did he turn back. Nayeli still stood by the fence, her hand trembling, her eyes wide with shadows of memory. "They didn't see you," Caleb said. "And if they had, it wouldn't matter." Her throat tightened. "Would you protect me?" He stepped close, laying a steady hand on her shoulder. "To my last breath." But danger didn't only ride from the north. It lived in her past, sharp and unyielding. That night, as wind clawed through the cracks, Nayeli spoke of the council that had condemned her. She told him how they tied her outside the elder's tent, left her in the rain, accused her of being a temptation, a shame. Each word fell heavy. A scar reopened. Caleb listened, his jaw hard, hands tightening into fists, when she lowered her eyes and whispered, "If they come, what will you do?" He met her gaze, gray eyes burning. "They won't take you. Not while you've chosen to stay here." The next morning, he led her beyond the barn, up the narrow rise. 2 wooden crosses stood there, weathered and bare against the wind, one tall, one smaller, both scarred by years of sun and storm. Caleb removed his hat, voice low. "Here lies Lena, and the child that never drew breath." Nayeli stood beside him, silent. The sky was a slate of gray, the grass brittle underfoot. Caleb knelt, pulling weeds from the base of the crosses, his movement slow, reverent. "I used to sit here half the day," he said, waiting for a sign, anything. But nothing came. After a while, I just came to make sure they weren't forgotten. Nayeli lowered herself to the ground, opening her hand. In her palm lay a necklace of beads, bone, shell, and a single blue stone. She placed it at the foot of the taller cross, saying nothing. The wind lifted strands of her hair, carrying the offering into the silence. Caleb's throat tightened, eyes wet though he did not turn away. For the first time in years, the burden of that hill no longer felt his alone. They stood there together until the wind cut colder, then turned back toward the cabin, side by side. For Caleb, it felt as though a door had closed behind him. He was no longer a man guarding graves. He was a man standing beside a living soul, one who had chosen to stay. That night, when the door shut against the howling wind, their eyes met in the glow of the firelight. What passed between them was no longer gratitude or wary trust. It was something harder, sharper, the resolve of 2 people ready to face whatever shadows might come. Not apart, but together. The morning sky was clear, spring light glinting off the damp grass. Caleb sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes resting on the faint green returning to the fields. Inside the doorway, Nayeli adjusted the blue dress she had pieced together from scraps in his trunk. It was simple but well made, shaping her full figure in ways she had once been ashamed of. Now she wore it hesitantly, as though stepping into sunlight after too long in shadow. Caleb watched her for a moment. "We'll need to ride into town today. We're out of salt. Coffee, nails." Her eyes widened. "You mean, you want me to come, I do," he said, steady but plain. Her hands tightened around the hem of her dress. The memory of being bound outside her people's council tent, the stares of judgment, came rushing back. "If someone recognizes me, if they ask who I am," Caleb set his cup aside and crossed the room. His rough hand rested gently on her shoulder. "Then they'll know. I'll tell them straight. You're my wife, Color rushed to her cheeks. Wife, but we've had no vows. No preacher doesn't matter. He cut in, his voice quiet but unshakable. What matters is that I choose to say it, and I don't say things I don't mean. She turned her head, hiding the trembling smile that rose despite her nerves. Awkwardness lingered, but underneath it her heart beat with a sudden warmth she hadn't felt in years. The ride into Dry Fork was long and dusty. Caleb rode at the reins, and she sat behind him, her arms looped around his waist, her hair lifting in the wind. She said little, only hearing the hammering of her own heart alongside the steady rhythm of hooves. The town was small, weather-worn buildings lining the dirt street, wagons hitched outside, townsfolk busy with their errands. But when they saw Caleb Mercer ride in, a man rarely seen beyond his valley, heads turned. More heads still when they saw the woman with him. He dismounted first, reaching back a hand. When she set her palm against his, she felt the solid pull that steadied her steps onto the street. Every glance around them felt sharp, judging. She wanted to lower her eyes, but Caleb's hand on her elbow urged her forward. Together they walked into Coyle's store. The gray-haired shopkeeper looked up. Caleb Mercer. Didn't think I'd see you again so soon. Solitude not enough to live on anymore. Caleb gave the faintest nod, then turned deliberately toward her. This is my wife. The room stilled for a beat. Coyle raised his brows, then offered a small, respectful nod. Ma'am Mercer. Nayeli's face flushed hot, and she dipped her head in reply. The words rang strange and sweet in her ears. Ma'am Mercer. For a moment, her throat ached with the urge to weep. As they gathered flour, coffee, and spools of thread, she still felt eyes following them. A pair of women whispered at the far shelf. Men on the porch leaned forward as though measuring her. Then one well-dressed young woman approached, her mouth tight. She yours an Apache? The tone was sharp with judgment. Caleb turned. Calm but hard as stone. She's my wife. The woman stiffened, lips pressed thin, and walked away without another word. Nayeli bit down on her lip, fear and relief mixing inside her chest. She had never known what it felt like to have someone stand so firmly at her side. The sun was low by the time they left town, painting the valley in gold, riding home. Her arms around Caleb were tighter than before, not from fear but from something softer, steadier. That night, while Caleb set the supplies on the table, Nayeli stood near the fire, her fingers brushing the red scarf she had chosen from Coyle's shelf. She turned to him, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. Did you truly mean what you said? That I'm your wife? He stepped closer, his gray gaze unwavering. I don't speak words I don't believe. Her lips curved into a shy, unsteady smile, half bashful, half joyful. In that old cabin, awkwardness had become a bridge. A man who had buried himself in silence. A woman once cast out in shame now standing together, unafraid of stares or whispers, choosing each other openly before the world. At first light, when mist still hung low over the valley, Nayeli stood leaning against the porch post, her hand resting lightly on her belly. Caleb, splitting wood nearby, paused and wiped the sweat from his brow. He noticed the gesture and set the axe aside. Are you unwell? He asked, his voice low with concern. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the fold of her dress. Not unwell, just different. Something inside me feels changed. She drew a breath, then spoke, her voice trembling, yet certain. I think I'm with child. For a moment, Caleb went still, his hand tightening around the axe handle. His gray eyes widened, surprise flickering into something softer, brighter. He stepped toward her, laying his rough palm gently over hers. Are you sure? Nayeli nodded, her lips trembling but her gaze steady. I've never been so sure of anything. A rare smile broke across Caleb's face. Not broad or loud, but quiet, like sunrise spilling over a darkened ridge. Then it's no longer just the two of us. We've become a family. In the days that followed, the cabin carried a new rhythm. Caleb cut and planed wood, shaping pieces into the beginnings of a cradle. Each hammer strike carried hope rather than habit. By the hearth, Nayeli sat sewing small garments, her hands steady, every stitch placed with care as though weaving a promise into cloth. One evening, beneath the silver wash of a full moon, Caleb joined her near the fire. He pulled a folded slip of paper from his pocket. "I went to Dry Fork yesterday," he said. "Spoke with the preacher." Her eyes widened. "You." He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I don't want you to be just a shadow in this house. I want the world to know you are my wife, the mother of my child." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not born of shame. They carried the release of years of sorrow giving way to joy. "I never thought I'd hear such words spoken for me," she whispered. 2 days later, beneath the oak tree behind the barn, a tree Caleb had planted years ago in memory of his wife and unborn child, they stood together. There was no lace, no music, no gathering crowd. Only the preacher, the wind through the branches, and two people who had found each other when they least expected it. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt, beard trimmed neat. Nayeli wore the blue dress she had sewn herself, her dark hair braided and tied with a single feather. When the preacher bowed his head in prayer, Caleb looked straight into her eyes. His voice rang steady, each word carved deep. "I choose you, Nayeli, for the rest of my life. I will live and die at your side." Her answer came quiet, but unwavering. "I have nowhere else in this world. You gave me shelter, and now I give you all I am, my heart, my body, and this child." They sealed their vows with a kiss, unhurried, tender, the meeting of two souls scarred but still alive. That night, back in the cabin, they sat near the fire. Caleb placed his hand over her belly. Silent, reverent. "Boy or girl, it doesn't matter. I only wanted to know it was wanted, and I want you to know you are wanted too." Nayeli leaned against his shoulder, whispering, "For the first time in my life, I know I am loved." The firelight danced in their eyes. The cabin, once a tomb of grief, had become the cradle of a new beginning. Trust and happiness were no longer distant hopes, but the warmth filling each corner of their home at the edge of the Arizona Valley. After the simple wedding beneath the oak tree, life at Caleb and Nayeli's cabin began to change day by day. It wasn't sudden or loud, but steady, certain like small green shoots breaking through hard, dry earth, where silence had once reigned. The house now carried faint laughter, gentle conversation, the rhythm of hammer on wood and needle through cloth. It was the sound of a new beginning. Caleb built a cradle with his own calloused hands. He chose solid boards, planed each surface smooth, and fitted the joints with care. Every strike of his hammer felt like a prayer for the child not yet born. He spent long hours under the porch roof, the sun warm on his back, sweat darkening his shirt, but his eyes carried a light they hadn't in years. A man once bound to graves and loss now found himself shaping something meant for life. Nayeli, meanwhile, sewed tiny clothes for the baby. She worked with scraps of fabric from Caleb's old trunk, paired with new thread bought in town. Her hands, once so used to shielding herself from shame, now moved with confidence, creating neat rows of stitches. She held up each finished piece as though she were holding the future itself. Every soft garment was more than cloth. It was a promise. At first, people in the valley watched with curiosity. They had long known Caleb as a man who kept to himself, rarely setting foot beyond his land. Now they saw him in town with a woman on his arm. Then heard word of a marriage. Then whispers of a child on the way. There were sidelong glances, questions left unspoken, even a few hard stares. But over time, curiosity gave way to something else. In Coyle's store, no one pressed anymore. Folks saw Caleb pay fare, stocking up on flour, salt, coffee, and cloth for his wife. They saw Nayeli stand beside him, shoulders straight, head high. A few women nodded quietly in her direction. Men who once muttered behind their cups now tipped their hats and called Caleb by name. Nayeli herself changed most of all. The body she once hid in shame no longer felt like a curse. She wore the blue dress she had sewn, tied a red scarf around her neck, braided her hair neatly, and walked through Dry Fork with her chin lifted. Each time Caleb placed his hand lightly on her back as they passed through the street. She felt it as a steady reminder, I belong here. Caleb changed too. The man who once avoided neighbors now faced the world with new strength. He never wasted words, never explained himself. He didn't need to. His actions building the cradle, mending the fence, buying fabric for his wife, standing tall beside her spoke clearer than anything. One evening, with the sun setting red over the ridges, Caleb carried the finished cradle out to the porch to sand it smooth one last time. Nayeli sat by the window, holding a tiny shirt fresh from her needle. They shared a look, no words needed. Both knew the past had closed its door, and the future was opening. That night, by the fire, Nayeli leaned against his shoulder. Do you think I deserve all of this? She whispered. Caleb turned to her, eyes steady and soft. Not only do you deserve it, you're the reason it exists. She pressed her lips together, fighting tears. For the first time, she believed him. Friends. If you've followed their story this far, you can likely feel the warmth taking root in this cabin. A man who once buried himself in grief, and a woman who was cast out for the shape of her own body, have built something no judgment could break a home. It's more than love. It's proof that even from ashes, people can write themselves a new fate. What do you think they should do next? Should Caleb and Nayeli expand the ranch, raising their child in the wider strength of community? Or should they simply guard this quiet valley, nurturing their small family and letting time itself prove their happiness? Share your thoughts. Your voices help keep stories like this alive. And don't forget, if this tale has touched your heart, leave a like and a comment. That simple act helps us keep the spirit of the frontier burning bright. The cabin on the edge of the Arizona Valley was no longer a place of exile for a widower. It had become the home of a family, where trust and joy grew stronger with each passing day. A new beginning had truly taken root.